I accidentally cursed at the Mafia boss. Just one small, stupid sentence. "What the hell are you staring at, bastard?" The entire restaurant went silent. The manager could barely stand. And he started walking toward me, the faint scent of gunpowder trailing behind every step. His voice was low, husky, as if he were savoring my fear. No one's ever said that to me, and kept breathing. I forced myself to look up, swallowed hard, and whispered, "Then today will be the first." He smiled, slow, merciless. Interesting, Waitress. I didn't know then that one careless curse had just written my fate. My name is Sienna Rossi. That moment, that tiny, stupid, accidental moment when the wineglass slipped and I got defensive. It felt like the kind of mistake that follows you forever, the kind that ruins your life not with a bang, but with a sudden, suffocating silence. I was working at the Obsidian, one of those places where the light is so dim it hides the cost of everything, and the clientele treat the staff like fixtures, not people. I'd been running plates all night. My feet were throbbing in the worn-out soles of my mandatory uniform shoes, and I was trying to navigate a narrow gap between a marble pillar and a man whose suit probably cost more than my annual rent. The glass of Cabernet slipped, not splashing a lot, just enough to leave that dark, angry stain right on his cuff and lapel, and before my brain could stop it, that word, bastard, just flew out. Quiet, under my breath, meant only for me. But of course, in a room that expensive, where every whispered agreement and every secret deal is amplified by the silence of the powerful, everything echoes. I stood there, frozen, the empty tray tilting in my hand, watching the world stop turning. And the way Lorenzo DeSantis looked at me, it wasn't anger that chilled me, it was nothingness. A complete, terrifying lack of emotion that made me understand in a flash that this man had the power to erase me without effort, and might just be deciding if I was worth the trouble of a single syllable, or if I should simply cease to exist. I remember thinking, just apologize, Sienna. Grovel, beg, that advice drilled into me since childhood, stay small, stay quiet, apologize for your existence, was screaming in my head. But the words caught in my throat. I've spent my whole life being told to be smaller, quieter, to make myself invisible because I grew up poor, because I was scraping by, because I wore a black uniform while they wore bespoke tailoring. Every time someone looks down their nose at you, every time you hear that soft, dismissive tsh of disapproval when you make a mistake, it builds up, brick by brick, into a quiet resentment, a kind of internal steel. And when Lorenzo DeSantis, the man whose name everyone whispered like a prayer and a threat, turned his cold eyes on me, I didn't just see a terrifying figure. I saw every entitled jerk who had ever ignored my existence, every client who had clicked their fingers at me, every landlord who had looked at me with pity. So, when he demanded I repeat the curse, I didn't flinch. I just stood up straighter, letting the tray drop silently to the carpet, and gave him the truth. A desperate, honest whisper that felt like a suicide note of dignity, choosing my own pride over the certainty of consequence. The manager, poor Arthur, who was about 3 seconds away from crying and stammering out apologies while trying futilely to wipe the stain, was completely ignored by Lorenzo. His focus never left me. He just paused, gave me that slow, unnerving smile that didn't reach his eyes, and then, without another word, he waved Arthur away, dismissed the entire scene, and disappeared into the night, leaving behind a silence so heavy I could barely breathe in it. I knew I was fired, but strangely a quiet wave of strength washed over me, having chosen defiance over submission, even if it was going to cost me everything I had. It's crazy to think about that night now, about how a spilled glass of wine became the single biggest turning point of my life. But that's how fate works sometimes. It uses the smallest cracks to let the light, or the darkness, in, not through grand design, but through sheer, stupid luck and recklessness. If you've ever had a moment where you stood up for yourself against someone who had all the power, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That rush of terror mixed with a thrilling, desperate freedom. I know this story is long, and it gets a little complicated, but the truth is, I'm sharing it because I know what it feels like to be overlooked, to be the one on the outside looking in, wishing someone would just see you for who you really are, not what you seem to be. So, if you're listening to this and you felt that, take a second right now, open your phone and do me a huge favor. Like this video, leave me a comment below so I know you're there, and hit that subscribe button. It helps me share more stories like this one, and it helps me feel less alone, knowing that my words are reaching people who understand the fight for dignity. Thanks, truly. Now, where was I? Oh, right. The morning after the spilled wine, I didn't even bother going in for my shift. I figured I was already history, that the consequences would come like a certified letter. Cold, official, and inevitable. Probably a phone call from Arthur demanding I return my uniform, but the consequences didn't come in a letter. They came back through the service entrance the next night, dressed in a black suit that looked sharper than any knife, the lapels tailored with the kind of precision that bespoke power, and smelling faintly of rain and expensive leather, a scent that now seemed inextricably linked to danger. Lorenzo DeSantis was sitting at the exact same VIP table, a table so far away from the kitchen that it was usually reserved for people who wanted to pretend they were deaf to the demands of the world. And when Arthur, the manager, went over to him, trembling visibly as he did, his hands shaking so much his pen clattered against his notepad, Lorenzo just pointed. Not at the menu, but toward me, standing in the back, polishing silverware I probably wouldn't get to use again. Arthur came over, pale as a linen napkin, his voice barely a squeak as he whispered that Mr. DeSantis had a new rule. No one served his table but me. I felt the color drain from my face, a cold dread replacing the dull resentment of the night before. This wasn't about apology or consequence anymore. It was about power, about seeing someone who dared to speak out and deciding to own them, to control them, not violently but with suffocating attention. He wanted me close but untouchable, like a dangerous curiosity he'd picked up, a pet viper he kept just to see how it moved. I walked the long, agonizing distance to his table, every eye in the room tracing my movement, feeling their judgments. Look at the brave one. Look at the foolish one. Does she think she's special now? I put down the water carafe, my hands perfectly steady despite the trembling in my core, and didn't look at his face. I focused only on the ice in his water glass, the way it clicked softly against the crystal, the miniature sound a huge distraction from the silence between us. He didn't order for a long time. He just sat there, in that heavy, expensive suit, and watched me. Not looking at me exactly, but looking through me, like he was solving a complex, multi-layered equation, and I was the variable he couldn't quite place, the one that kept throwing off his calculations. I remember trying to breathe shallowly so he couldn't measure the rise and fall of my chest, hoping my stillness would mimic the marble surrounding us. But I knew he was counting every intake of air anyway, assessing my fear and resilience. I kept waiting for the cutting remark, the order to drop to my knees, the demand for repayment. But all he did was sit in silence, occasionally sipping his water, making the minutes stretch into hours, each one a psychological torture session. It was the most unnerving experience of my life, worse than the shouting match or the threats, because it was pure, concentrated psychological pressure, the kind that makes you question your own sanity, wondering if you're seeing things or if the whole world is just holding its breath with you, waiting for you to break. Finally, after what felt like the entirety of the 3-hour dinner service had evaporated into the heavy air, he stood up. He didn't rush or make any sudden movements that might betray impatience. He smoothed the front of his jacket, reached into the breast pocket with unhurried precision, and produced a simple, matte black card, no logo, no name, just embossed white text that stated an address and a date. He laid it flat on the pristine white tablecloth, right where my hand would have to hover to clear the water glass. And his voice, that low, rough rumble, finally broke the silence, sounding like gravel shifting. "You owe me one dinner, Sienna Rossi, my place." He didn't wait for a response or a question. He simply walked away, leaving me standing there with the card, which felt heavy and dangerous, like a single live bullet placed squarely in my palm. As I rode the subway home later that night, the black card tucked inside the lining of my worn-out wallet, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of those cold, calculating eyes still measuring my movements in the dark. I glanced back, quickly, then casually, checking the platform and the cars, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual late-night crowd, the tired faces illuminated by the passing lights, the bright advertisements glaring down. But the feeling persisted, a prickle of professional unease that I'd never experienced before, and I walked the last 2 blocks to my apartment building faster than usual, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, convinced that the shadows were moving on their own. I was fumbling with my keys in the dark, the streetlights buzzing with their usual lonely sound, casting long, distorted shadows on the brick wall of my apartment building, when my cheap plastic phone started vibrating violently in my hand, making me jump and drop my keys. The screen showed an unknown number, blocked and ominous. I hesitated, then answered, holding the phone loosely against my ear, listening to the static hiss. It was his voice, calm and dark, cutting through the noise like a sharp blade of ice. "Turn around, Sienna." My breath hitched in my chest, a sudden, sharp intake of air. I slowly pivoted, my eyes searching the darkened street, the alleys, the rooftops. But I still couldn't see anyone. Just shadows playing tricks and a few distant car lights. "Who is that?" I whispered, my voice thick with fear, the sound barely audible even to myself. "The one watching you," he answered, and I heard a metallic sound, like a car door closing very softly, very far away, then the subtle rumble of an engine starting up. He paused, letting the silence settle like dust, thick with unspoken threat. "Go inside. I protect what amuses me. You're not quite finished being interesting yet." The line went dead. I didn't need any more instruction. I scrambled inside, slammed the heavy door shut, slid the chain lock on with shaking hands, and leaned against the wood, trying to regulate my breathing. The full weight of what had happened hit me then. I hadn't just insulted a rich man. I had attracted the attention of a predator. And now, my life, my very presence in the world, was under his surveillance, subject to his rules. He hadn't punished me. He had claimed me, and I was absolutely terrified. But a tiny, reckless part of me, the part that had cursed him in the first place, was also buzzing with a dangerous kind of curiosity about what exactly he saw in me that was so amusing, and what those rules might turn out to be. A week later, the invitation came. Not another black card, but a formal ivory envelope delivered to my tiny apartment by a driver in a pristine white uniform, an almost comical image against the backdrop of my shabby street, like something out of a period drama that had taken a wrong turn. It was written in elegant, looping script, stating the time and the address, the DeSantis estate, far up the Hudson, for a formal dinner. I spent the day agonizing over what to wear, feeling the immense pressure of presenting myself in a world where appearances were everything. I didn't have a closet full of designer clothes. I had 2 decent dresses, one for weddings and one for funerals, and they were both well worn, carefully pressed, but ultimately humble. I finally chose the wedding dress, a simple, dark emerald sheath that hugged my figure nicely, but had absolutely no flash or expense to it, relying on dignity alone to carry the weight. When the sleek black sedan pulled up to collect me, gliding silently to a stop, I felt like I was walking the plank, leaving everything familiar behind. The drive was long and silent, taking me further and further away from the familiar noise and grime of the city, and into a world of massive, imposing wrought iron gates and perfectly manicured lawns that seemed to stretch forever into the twilight. The mansion itself wasn't just large, it was overwhelming, a fortress of limestone and ambition, designed to intimidate. And I remember feeling the air itself get thinner, heavier, as I stepped out of the car. The silence broken only by the crunch of my cheap heels on the immaculate gravel. I had prepared myself for a private, tense dinner with just Lorenzo, maybe a couple of bodyguards, a final, silent payment of my debt. But as the immense mahogany doors were opened by a man who looked like he could snap me in half, revealing the world inside, The sound that hit me was not the quiet clinking of silverware, but a deafening roar of conversation, laughter, and high-stakes politics. It wasn't a private dinner. It was a grand Mafia banquet, the kind of event where wealth and power were the only currencies, and every piece of jewelry, every laugh, every handshake was a calculated move. I, in my simple emerald dress and slightly scuffed heels, was suddenly deposited right into the middle of the kings and queens, the air thick with the smell of old money and new schemes. My stomach dropped. I was underdressed, profoundly out of place, and clearly an object of immediate, intense scrutiny. As I tried to find a corner to shrink into, to become part of the dark wood paneling, a woman approached me. She was stunning, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a dress that looked like liquid gold, flowing around her like water. This was Allegra de Santis, Lorenzo's sister, a renowned psychologist and, I quickly learned, a woman who didn't tolerate fools or distractions, her eyes holding the same icy calculation as her brother's, but with an academic's detachment. She looked me up and down, a look that wasn't judgmental so much as clinically dissecting, measuring my threat level and my potential utility, and she delivered her line with the perfect, icy pitch of high society disbelief. My brother invited a waitress to the king's table? How utterly bohemian. It wasn't loud, but it cut straight through the noise, silencing the conversations immediately around us, and several heads turned to openly stare at me, their eyes dismissing me completely, their conversation already moving on to matters of real importance before Allegra had even finished her sentence. Before I could even formulate the one-sentence retort I knew was necessary, the quiet, precise words that would deflect without begging, another man slid up to me, his smile all teeth and ambition. This was Marco De Luca, Lorenzo's underboss, a man whose tailored suit couldn't hide the coiled, ruthless energy beneath. A dangerous man with an easy charm that barely masked the pure, cynical calculation in his eyes. He put a hand too close to my elbow and leaned in, his breath smelling faintly of expensive scotch and cheap cologne. "Don't mind Allegra, Bella," he purred, though his eyes were anything but kind, looking me over like a piece of questionable property. "She just doesn't understand modern art, or her brother's eccentric tastes. Is she?" He paused, letting his gaze sweep over my humble dress again, making me feel the cheapness of the fabric against my skin. The new decoration? Something to remind us all where we came from? Or perhaps just a very expensive joke that only Lorenzo understands? The humiliation was a physical burn in my cheeks, a hot, angry flush. But I refused to meet his gaze with anything but steady calm, holding his stare until he subtly shifted his weight, momentarily uncomfortable. I pulled my elbow away, smoothly, without haste or drama, and tightened my grip on my small clutch bag, a silent, visible act of boundary setting that he definitely noticed. I looked past Marco, across the vast, noisy room, straight to the head of the table where Lorenzo sat, watching the entire exchange with an unnerving, godlike detachment. He saw Allegra's sneer. He saw Marco's smirk. And he did nothing. He didn't intervene, didn't defend, didn't even signal with his eyes, but simply observed. In that moment, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of dollars of silk and diamonds, I realized the cold truth. I wasn't his date, his obsession, or even his prisoner. I was a prop, a pawn, a strange, expendable variable he had introduced into his complex political game to see how I would behave, to see if I would submit or if I would fight back against the calculated cruelty of his world. The dinner itself was a blur of forced smiles and cold porcelain, and I kept my mouth shut, listening more than talking, realizing that every word spoken in this room was a negotiation, a threat, a lie, or an attempt to assess loyalty. I was placed strategically, far enough from Lorenzo to be mocked, but close enough for him to observe my reaction to the mockery, like a scientist watching a petri dish filled with bacteria. Allegra kept her distance, watching me with that calculating, clinical interest, occasionally raising an eyebrow when I declined an offer of wine, clearly testing my self-control, while Marco kept trying to make small talk, his questions too probing, too interested in my background, my family, and how I knew Lorenzo, all of which I answered with quiet, one-word responses that gave him absolutely nothing to work with. The hours dragged, the pressure building inside me, and I was ready to leave, ready to face the long, silent ride home and process the heavy toll of the evening when the whole atmosphere shifted, fast and lethally. The loud conversations cut off instantly, replaced by the sharp, undeniable sound of breaking glass from the far wall and a sudden desperate surge toward the doors. It wasn't a fire drill or a power outage, it was something far worse, a targeted, professional intrusion. The next thing I knew, the room was chaos, screams and the deep, hollow thump of silenced gunshots echoing off the high, frescoed ceilings. Assassins had stormed the mansion, their target clearly Allegra, who was standing frozen near the central fireplace, her sharp intellect suddenly rendered useless by pure, terrifying instinct. Everyone else was diving under tables or trying to flee in a stampede of silk and panic. But in that split second, everything slowed down for me. I saw the trajectory. One of the attackers, cloaked in black, was raising his weapon, aimed directly at Allegra's chest. A point-blank, certain kill shot. I didn't think about it. I didn't have time to consider the danger or the consequence. My whole life has been about protecting myself, about not getting hurt, about survival, but some deeper, quieter instinct, the one that hated the cruelty and the unfairness of this world, the one that refused to watch a woman be executed, took over. I lunged, not forward but sideways, throwing myself in front of Allegra with a sudden, desperate burst of energy, shoving her out of the direct line of fire with a heavy thud against the wall. The sound of the shot was deafeningly close, ripping through the air beside my ear. And then came the blinding, white-hot, tearing pain in my upper arm, like being struck by a hammer and a branding iron at the same time, the force of the impact spinning me around. I remember a gasp that wasn't mine, and then the sickening feeling of my knees hitting the expensive Persian rug, the wool rough against my bare skin. Allegra, though stunned, was immediately beside me, holding my weight. Her golden dress now smeared with my blood, her own breath ragged. And that's when everything changed, irrevocably. Lorenzo, who had been commanding the room with his presence even during the attack, his own gun now drawn and firing with brutal efficiency at the intruders, suddenly stopped. His icy composure, the mask he never let slip, the thing that made him a monster and a genius, shattered. He looked at me, lying there on the floor, bleeding for his sister, for his family, and the coldness vanished, replaced by a raw, primal panic that was terrifying to witness. He was suddenly running toward me, abandoning the fight, his face an unreadable mixture of fear and rage, his voice rough and guttural. The fight was still going on, but for him it seemed to stop completely, focused only on my broken form. He was there, kneeling beside me, his large, powerful hands supporting my head, ignoring the blood soaking his bespoke cuff, his entire posture radiating frantic urgency. Allegra was shouting something to the remaining guards, her clinical mind back online, directing the cleanup. But I couldn't hear her over the ringing in my ears and the dull throb of the wound. I could only see Lorenzo's eyes, which were no longer cold, no longer measuring, but burning with a fierce, protective fire I had never imagined he possessed. A raw emotion that bordered on grief and shock. He looked down at my pale, sweaty face, then at the wound I had taken for his family, and he gently brushed the hair back from my forehead, his touch surprisingly tender. The fight was dying down as his security detail overwhelmed the last attackers, but before he allowed anyone to touch me, he turned to his sister, who was staring at me with a look of stunned disbelief, her face white with shock. "She saved you," he whispered, his voice still thick with panic, unable to fully grasp the sacrifice. "No one touches her now, not ever. She is under my protection." And then, as the doctors were ushered in and started cutting away the sleeve of my emerald dress, he leaned down close to me, his lips almost touching my ear. The whisper low and gravelly meant only for me. A secret promise. She doesn't know it yet, but she just changed her fate. This is the only currency that matters in this house. I drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain dulling everything to a hazy gray. But that single phrase changed her fate, echoed in the darkness, replacing the dull dread with a strange, terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, I had bought my way out of being a pawn and into something that actually mattered to him, a place where my quiet integrity was finally valued. I was relocated to a private wing of the mansion, not as a prisoner, but as a bizarre, wounded guest, untouchable because of the debt of life I held over Allegra, and therefore over Lorenzo. The wound wasn't life-threatening, but it was severe, tearing through muscle, and it kept me confined and weak for weeks, making every movement a conscious, painful effort. Allegra visited me often, not with gifts or apologies, but with cool, professional curiosity, often bringing complex medical texts and asking strange, probing questions that had nothing to do with my physical health and everything to do with my moral compass. She was trying to understand the spontaneous, reckless action I took, the instinct of a low-status person to sacrifice herself for a person of power she barely knew. A complete contradiction to the survival instincts of her cynical world. It simply didn't compute in her calculated psychological framework. She started to see me, not as the waitress her brother had brought in for amusement, but as a person, a complex puzzle, and eventually maybe a reluctant friend, bringing me books and sitting in long, comfortable silences. The tension between us shifted from icy dismissal to a fragile, respect-based truce, cemented by shared blood. Lorenzo visited less often, but when he did, his presence was overwhelmingly intense. He would sit by the window, never looking directly at me, his gaze fixed on the outside world, and just talk business, allowing me to hear the intricate, dangerous rhythms of his world. The betrayals, the deals, the constant shifting threats that he navigated daily. It felt like he was teaching me the rules of the game I had inadvertently joined, making me an unconscious apprentice, but without ever acknowledging the intimacy of the lesson or the cost of the wound that kept me there. I was finally up and moving around, albeit still weak, doing light physical therapy exercises to regain the strength in my arm, when the past reached out and slapped me across the face, disrupting the fragile peace I had found. I was sitting in the conservatory, trying to read a book Allegra had given me, enjoying the weak winter sunlight, when a man I knew too well appeared in the archway, looking tragically out of place in his cheap, ill-fitting suit and nervous, hunted posture. It was Inspector Reed, my ex-boyfriend, the one who had disappeared from my life 6 months prior, the one who had always looked at me with a kind of desperate intensity that I mistook for love. His appearance immediately made the air feel thick and dangerous, because Reed wasn't just my ex. He was an FBI agent, and I suddenly understood the real heavy cost of our long-ago messy relationship. He looked haggard, tired, lines of stress etched around his eyes, but there was a desperate intensity in his gaze, a frantic energy that spoke of imminent danger. He pleaded with me, kept his voice low and urgent, his eyes darting to the doors. "Sienna, you're living in a nest of vipers. This place, it's a time bomb and you're the fuse. You're lucky to be alive. Help me bring him down. You're already inside, you're untouchable now, a protected witness. Give me something, anything, and I'll get you out of here. I'll protect you. We can start over." He thought he was saving me, playing the hero. But I knew he was just trying to use me one more time, just like he had used me to get close to the periphery of this world before, trying to get information that I didn't even know I was carrying, turning my sacrifice into a cynical tool for his own ambition. The confrontation came 2 days later, not in a darkened hallway, but in the main study, a place of dark wood and even darker secrets, where the air itself seemed to vibrate with unspoken power. Lorenzo called a meeting, a small, intimate gathering of his most trusted people, Allegra, Marco, and me, still looking like a walking patient in my oversized sweater and sling, a clear mark of my recent sacrifice. He didn't shout. He never shouted, relying on atmosphere and implication to convey his threat. He simply laid a thin manila envelope on the massive walnut desk and slid it toward me, the sound of the paper scratching the wood immense in the silence. It was an FBI surveillance file, grainy photos of me and Reed together, documents showing his current rank, and his history of trying to cultivate sources near the DeSantis family. "Are you a spy, Sienna?" His voice was utterly devoid of emotion, a flat, lethal query that cut straight to my soul, freezing the air in my lungs. I felt the blood draining from my face, a sudden cold rush of panic because while I hadn't meant to spy, the connection was undeniable, and the evidence, my heart, my past, my broken trust, was right there on the table, proving my guilt in the language of their world. I started to plead, stammering out the truth, how Reed had used me, how I hadn't seen him in months, how I'd been here by accident, not by design, and how I had just taken a bullet for his family, the bandage on my arm a visible testament to my loyalty. But before the words could even form a complete sentence, Marco, the smiling underboss, stepped forward, his expression grave and sincere, the picture of measured loyalty. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out another, smaller set of photographs, old vacation snaps, taken years ago, showing me and Reed on a beach in a happy, intimate embrace, undeniable proof of a shared life. They were pictures Allegra and Lorenzo had never seen, evidence of a deeper, more committed relationship than I had ever admitted to, the kind that screamed long-term plant to anyone in their world. Marco slid them across the desk, a quiet, deadly flourish, his timing too perfect, too devastating. "Mr. DeSantis, with all respect, La Cameriera lies. This is not a coincidence. It is a long-standing pattern of deception, a calculated infiltration." Allegra's face hardened immediately. She saw the betrayal, not just of her brother, but of her own growing, cautious trust in me, her initial defense crumbling instantly. She didn't look at me anymore. She looked at Lorenzo, her eyes cold with confirmation, the puzzle pieces clicking perfectly into place for her. Lorenzo, for his part, didn't even glance at the photos. He just kept his gaze locked on me, his eyes now truly, completely frozen over, colder than the night he first demanded I repeat the curse. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He stood up, his silence thundering in the room, filling every corner, and then he spoke the one sentence that cost me everything, ending my reprieve. "Get her out of my sight." I was dismissed, cast out, despised by the very world I had tried to save, a traitor in the eyes of the law. And now, a liar in the world of the damned, my sacrifice utterly meaningless. They escorted me out, not with violence or shouting, but with a cold, terrifying finality, handled like a piece of refuse being quietly removed. I was put into a car and driven toward the city, abandoned on a rainy corner with nothing but the small bag I'd arrived with, my throbbing shoulder, and the shattered pieces of my honor. I stood there, soaking wet, watching the black car disappear around the wet bend of the road, feeling the profound, crushing weight of having nothing left. No home, no job, no allegiance, and no one to turn to. But as I stumbled toward the bus stop, hugging my bag close to my chest, my body shaking more from anger than from cold, I felt a strange, detached calm setting in. The humiliation, the betrayal, the pain, it all stripped away the fear, leaving behind only clarity, a raw, crystalline understanding of the events, and in that clarity I started replaying the scene in the study. Marco's sudden, quiet presentation of the old photos, his eagerness to confirm my guilt. It didn't fit. Marco had been in the room when I took the bullet for Allegra. He saw my honesty, my impulsive sacrifice, and yet he was the one who delivered the final, fatal proof of my betrayal, choosing to remove me now, when I had the most political capital. Why? If he truly cared about Lorenzo's security, he would have brought the photos forward the second I was admitted to the house, not waited until I was recovering, untouchable, and gaining Allegra's trust. It was too convenient, too perfectly timed to make me look like a long-term FBI plant who had suddenly been activated. It was a flicker of suspicion that ignited into a burning certainty, a fire in my gut that dried the tears before they could fall. Marco wasn't protecting Lorenzo. He was systematically replacing him, piece by piece, removing every loyal ally and neutral observer. He didn't want me gone because I was a spy. He wanted me gone because I was now close to Lorenzo, because I had Allegra's protection, and because, in his cold calculus, I had become an unpredictable variable that might accidentally expose his real treachery. He had to be selling intel, not to the FBI directly, but perhaps to a rival faction, or even to the same people who had sent the assassins. And he was using me, the convenient, humble waitress with the FBI ex-boyfriend, as the perfect, easy scapegoat to cover his tracks. The realization hit me with a jolt of ice-cold energy, overriding the pain in my shoulder and the sorrow in my heart. I didn't care about Lorenzo's approval anymore, or Allegra's trust. This was about reclaiming my dignity, about proving the truth I knew in my soul. I had been condemned as a traitor, and now I had the undeniable truth that could clear my name and expose the real enemy. I turned around, ignoring the cold rain that plastered my hair to my face, and started walking back the way I came, my pace quick and determined, fueled by a singular, focused rage. There was only one way to reclaim my honor, and it wasn't by running away. It was by walking straight back into the fire. I knew I couldn't just walk back through the front gate, which would be heavily guarded, so I used the small details I'd absorbed during my time in the mansion's private wing, the subtle lessons Lorenzo hadn't known he was teaching me. I knew the service elevator code for the kitchen, and I knew the schedule of the patrols near the back casino entrance, the one Lorenzo used when he wanted a quiet, late-night game with his inner circle, the one Marco had likely compromised. I broke in, easily, quietly, sliding through the shadows of the immense, opulent casino that occupied the mansion's entire lower floor, the air stale and quiet after the party. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it echoing in the cavernous space, but my hands were steady, locked onto the simple purse that contained my last secrets. I wasn't here to beg forgiveness or try to explain. I was here for a confrontation, a final, lethal exchange of truth for truth. I found him in his private office, a darkened, smoke-filled room with a single, harsh desk lamp, casting deep, dramatic shadows, making him look like a tragic figure. He was sitting there, nursing a drink, looking tired, older, and somehow more dangerous in his solitude, the weight of my perceived betrayal clearly heavy on him. He looked up when I entered, the shadow moving across his face, and his eyes narrowed, that chilling blankness instantly returning. A wall of pure disbelief and cold fury. Before I could even speak, the lethal calm in his voice descended upon me, quieter and more dangerous than any roar. Back to your betrayal games, Sienna? The FBI must be running a terrible operation to send you back into the fire so quickly. They underestimated me, but it seems you did too. You think this game has a second chance for people like you? I stood in the doorway, my hand instinctively holding my injured shoulder, and I held his gaze without flinching, refusing to show the fear that coiled in my stomach. I didn't try to explain or beg or offer flimsy excuses. I simply stated the truth, cutting through his cynicism with raw honesty. Marco is the traitor. He's been feeding the opposition, not me. He used my past with Reed, those convenient photos, to remove the biggest threat to his ambition. Me, the bulletproof witness who took a bullet for your family and gained your sister's trust. He didn't respond, just watched, his expression completely unreadable, his large, powerful hand slowly sliding toward the drawer where I knew he kept a gun, a movement so subtle it was almost missed. I knew he wouldn't believe me based on words alone, not after seeing those manufactured photos. I had to create a moment of undeniable action, a split-second shift that would force his hand and expose the real enemy without a shadow of a doubt. He pulled the gun out of the drawer, a heavy, matte black automatic, the kind of weapon that meant business, and leveled it at my chest, his grip steady and unhesitating. You've run out of words, Cameriera. Get out or pay the price. You have 5 seconds to walk. It was a threat, a final warning, but it was also a desperate test. I knew that if I left now, I would never return, and the truth would die with me. I had to be more extreme, more undeniable than his doubt, proving my purpose was not escape but confrontation. I pulled my own small, concealed pistol out of my bag, the one Allegra had taught me to handle during my recovery. A small, silver thing that felt feather-light and inadequate in my hand. I didn't aim at him. That would be suicide. I raised the gun and fired, not at Lorenzo, not at the floor, but at a priceless crystal display case full of antique family medallions hanging on the wall right beside his head. The sound was deafening, a sharp crack that echoed through the dark office, and the shattered crystal cascaded down onto the mahogany desk in a blinding, glittering shower. It was a warning shot, a declaration of war, and an intentional act of destruction that screamed urgency. That immense sound, the sheer audacity of the action, brought Marco rushing in from the next room, followed by 2 of his personal men, his face pale with alarm and feigned concern. "What happened? Lorenzo, are you all right? It's her. She's armed. Get her," he shouted, drawing his own weapon, playing the perfect, concerned underboss walking into a crisis. Lorenzo's eyes darted from me, standing steady with smoke curling from the barrel of my ridiculous little gun, to Marco, whose immediate and panicked rush to judgment and the sudden convenient presence of his own armed men waiting in the wings was all the proof Lorenzo needed. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place for him instantly. He lowered his gun slightly, not at me, but at the floor, and his voice was suddenly a roar, deep and commanding, directed at Marco, not at me. "Marco, why are your personal men here? This is my secure office, and they are not on my rotation." Marco stammered, caught in the act of his own false loyalty, his professional facade cracking. As the air thickened with tension, Marco realized he was exposed and out of time. He made his final, desperate move, leveling his gun at Lorenzo, ready to finish the job he had botched in the casino. But before he could squeeze the trigger, the room erupted into total chaos. Gunfire came from the hallway. Lorenzo's loyal security detail, alerted by my calculated warning shot, had rushed the office, assuming Marco was the threat and saving us the final fight. As bullets whizzed past, tearing scars into the rich wood paneling and shredding priceless books, Lorenzo didn't hesitate. He reacted instantly, throwing himself forward, grabbing my arm, and shielding me with his own body as he pulled us both down violently behind the heavy walnut desk. His breath was hot on my ear, his voice tight and fierce, mixing with the deafening crossfire and the sound of falling plaster. "You came back," he whispered, a statement of profound, terrible respect. "Not for me. For honor. You did not run." In the midst of the violence, I knew I had succeeded. Not in gaining his love, but in earning his absolute, terrifying trust. The situation was stabilized. Marco and his personal guards were neutralized, their bodies silent and still on the expensive carpet, and the real depth of his conspiracy was confirmed within the hour, as Allegra efficiently secured the evidence. Marco had indeed been selling the location of every asset, every meeting, every vulnerability of the DeSantis empire for months, all while pretending to be the most loyal man in the room. I was allowed to stay in the mansion, not as a guest or a pawn, but as a silent partner, a living debt of honor, and the one person who had proven she valued the truth more than her own safety or life. But my position in that dark world was still dangerously fragile. The whispers started immediately, of course, twisting the truth into rumor. "She's DeSantis's weakness. He trusts a waitress more than his own family and his own common sense. The underworld, which measures worth by brute strength and cold calculation, couldn't understand the quiet strength of my action, and they immediately branded me as the thing that would eventually bring Lorenzo down, the emotional liability. The whispers were like poison, seeping into every corner of the vast house, making me feel visible and terribly vulnerable in a way I hadn't been before. A constant, low-level threat that never went away. Allegra, now my fierce, protective ally, saw the danger immediately. She saw the inevitable chain reaction my presence would cause in a world defined by the absence of mercy. She found me sitting alone one evening, staring out at the moonlit grounds, and sat down opposite me without a word, pushing a heavy glass of brandy toward me. She looked tired, her sharp eyes dark with the strain of their life. and she spoke to me not as a therapist or a sister of a boss, but as a woman who understood the language of loss and strategy. Sienna, they see you as a target because they see what you are to him, even if he hasn't named it. The one thing he didn't anticipate and can't control. She paused, tracing the rim of her coffee cup, the silence stretching long and thin. Love in this world is a curse, not a blessing. It's a weakness you leave exposed for your enemies to exploit. They can't kill Lorenzo easily, but they can hurt him by destroying what he values, and you are now his greatest treasure. She was warning me, honestly and without melodrama, of the inevitable danger that came with being seen, truly seen, by a man like Lorenzo, laying out the calculus of sacrifice on the table between us. And I watched her words come true. Enemies started sending funeral cards, thick, expensive paper, sealed with black wax, addressed to Lorenzo, but with my name subtly written in the space for the deceased, a clear, open threat. Open threats, visible reminders that my life was the pressure point, the knife they would twist in his side, a constant countdown. I watched Lorenzo's power subtly erode, piece by piece, just to protect me from these constant petty attacks and large-scale threats. He had to pull assets from his territory, divert guards from lucrative positions, and cancel profitable deals, all because the simple presence of the waitress who had cursed him had made him predictable, vulnerable, and domestically tied up. The very thing he had admired about me, my impulsive bravery, was now the thing that jeopardized his entire empire, and the love that had been forged in the fire of betrayal was quickly becoming the greatest threat to his life and the stability of his organization. I saw the strain on his face, the dark circles under his eyes, the way he would suddenly stop mid-sentence, lost in thought, calculating the cost of my safety against the survival of his empire. I felt a terrible, crushing guilt, a weight that settled deep in my bones. And one night, as I watched him study a complex map of the city, outlining new, costly security routes, I couldn't stop the tears that finally broke free. I put my hand on his broad, weary shoulder and whispered the terrible truth I knew in my heart. I don't want to be your ruin, Lorenzo. I can't be the one who destroys everything you built, everything you fought to keep. I felt acutely the profound loneliness of being loved in a world that rewarded only cruelty. And I knew that to truly save him, to protect the integrity of his work and his life, I had to choose a different kind of sacrifice. I had to disappear, but on my terms, in a way that would serve him. I decided to leave the next morning, to save him from the constant threat my presence represented, believing it was the only way to break the cycle. But Allegra found me packing my small bag in the pre-dawn quiet, her movements silent as a shadow. She wasn't angry. She looked determined, her eyes blazing with a fierce, terrible intelligence that matched my own resolve. Don't you dare run away now, Sienna. That is exactly what they expect you to do. That is the weak move, the predictable choice. And that will not save him. It will just confirm to them that he is weak. She stopped me, not with an order or an appeal to my emotions, but with a question that demanded a commitment. Do you trust me enough to fight the only way we can? I nodded, because the respect between us was now absolute, forged in the heat of violence. She handed me a heavy, cold handgun, larger and more serious than my little silver one. Good. Then you won't leave. You will help me save him by giving them what they want, but on our terms. She outlined the plan quickly, efficiently, a complex high-stakes trap that weaponized my perceived weakness, turning the underworld's assumptions, that I was a gold-digging traitor, against them. We were going to stage a fake betrayal, an engineered fall from grace involving an engagement ceremony between me and Marco, who, unbeknownst to the outside world, was only moments away from becoming a very dead former problem. The ceremony was set for 2 nights later, a rushed, garish affair in the casino where I had fired the warning shot, deliberately designed to be as loud and offensive as possible to the traditionalists who valued decorum. The rumor mill was working overtime, spinning tales of Lorenzo's reckless folly, his replacement by the ambitious Marco, and his desperation to marry the low-status waitress to save face. Allegra had told Lorenzo the bare bones of the plan, that we were setting a trap for Marco's remaining assets. But she had deliberately withheld the most painful, personal detail. The staged affection that would break his heart. Marco, arrogant and completely confident in his upcoming coronation as the new ruler, played the role of the devoted future husband with nauseating, practiced sincerity, his eyes glittering with triumph. I wore a white dress Allegra insisted upon, feeling like a sacrificial lamb dressed for a cruel carnival. And I kept my eyes focused only on the single, terrifying purpose: dignity and survival. We stood beneath a massive, glittering chandelier, surrounded by the very people who had whispered the cruelest things about me, waiting for the signal, waiting for the moment the trap would spring. Marco leaned down for the staged, celebratory kiss, his lips pressing against mine. A cold, dry contact. A moment of profound, sickening revulsion that I forced myself to endure for the fraction of a second required. And right as the moment of false intimacy peaked, the doors to the casino flew open, slamming against the walls, and there stood Lorenzo. Allegra had ensured he would arrive at this exact moment, ensuring maximum emotional impact and public exposure. The fury that blazed in his eyes was not feigned. It was raw, blinding, and completely real, a shockwave of betrayed passion. He saw the kiss. He saw the betrayal he believed was happening. And for a split second, I saw his soul crack, his posture slump in disbelief. Marco, emboldened by the fury he had successfully provoked in his rival, and believing he now had the definitive upper hand, pulled a gun from his vest, leveling it not at me, but at Lorenzo, ready to finish the job he had botched in the office. In that instant, with the room frozen in silent horror, I moved. A blur of white silk and focused action. Allegra's training, the cold, hard logic of her plan, took over my instincts. I twisted free of Marco's grasp, raising the heavy handgun she had given me, and I fired. The shot was deafening, final and precise, the bullet hitting its mark instantly. Marco's body jerked backward, his ambitious smirk replaced by a sudden, vacant shock, and he crumpled to the floor, his life extinguished in a single, loud moment of consequence. The chaos that followed was immediate, a stampede of screaming guests and shouting guards, but I barely noticed it. The sound of the shot was all I could hear, ringing in my ears, the metallic smell of gunpowder all I could register, masking the smell of blood. My gun slipped from my trembling fingers and clattered to the marble floor, the noise hollow and final. I stood there watching the man who had tried to destroy me bleed out, and I felt nothing but a terrifying, exhausting emptiness, the complete lack of satisfaction that comes with necessary killing. Then, Lorenzo was there, pushing past his guards, rushing not to the scene of the death, but straight to me, his focus absolute. He ignored the dead body and the frantic people, his eyes locked onto my face, searing into my own. He caught my trembling hands in his own, which were surprisingly warm, and held them tight, forcing me to look at him, to see the realization dawning in his eyes. His expression was a storm of relief, terror, and absolute possession. His theory of my betrayal instantly replaced by the terrifying truth of my commitment. "You killed my traitor, Sienna," he murmured, his voice low and possessive, his eyes never leaving mine. "You made your choice. You belong with me now, in this ruin you just helped create." The declaration wasn't a question or an order. It was a simple statement of fact. A claim laid on a woman who had weaponized her weakness and turned it into a lethal defense, proving she was his equal, the one who had bought her place in his dark kingdom with blood and honor. Marco was dead, his conspiracy exposed, and my name was cleared. But the consequences of his final act were yet to come. As the last of Marco's remaining loyalists were subdued by Allegra's guards, a small, quiet hiss came from the center of the casino floor, followed by a faint, metallic clicking sound that only Allegra, the hyper-aware psychologist who understood the enemy's mind, recognized immediately. Marco, in his final, meticulous planning, had planted a timed bomb beneath the mansion, designed to take out his rivals. And now, the timer was ticking toward 0. Sirens were wailing outside, the sound of the world finally rushing in on this private theater of violence. But there was no time. There was no time to get everyone out. No time to evacuate the entire massive structure. The security team focused on getting Allegra and Lorenzo to safety, rushing them toward the distant cellar tunnels. But I was suddenly shoved, hard, into a corner of the main lobby by a collapsing piece of ceiling, trapped beneath the heavy plaster and shattered marble, my injured arm screaming in protest as the debris pressed down on my legs. Smoke was pouring from the floorboards, thick and acrid, burning my throat, and the heat was rising fast, the flames already licking at the edges of the room, turning the grand hall into a furnace. I was trapped, immobilized, nowhere to run. The immense marble hall shrinking rapidly into a fiery coffin of smoke and heat, the ceiling threatening to collapse completely. Through the haze and the sound of distant yelling, I heard Lorenzo's voice, raw and desperate, screaming through a security radio one of the guards had dropped near me, a lifeline I couldn't reach. "Sienna! Sienna! Say something! Tell me you're coming out, for God's sake, tell me you're alive!" His calm, cold exterior was completely gone, replaced by the terrifying sound of a man who had finally lost control, utterly terrified of losing the one person who had fought for his honor. I knew there was no escape, not from this distance, not with the ceiling on my legs, and I felt the cold realization of my imminent death settle over me, replacing the fear with a strange, detached peace. I could hear the countdown, the final, desperate electronic ticking muffled beneath the smoke, and I smiled weakly, looking up at the smoke-filled ceiling, and I whispered into the discarded radio, my voice hoarse, using the very words that had started this entire, terrible journey, bringing the story full circle. "Say that again." Slowly. My voice was barely a whisper, swallowed by the immediate, massive roar of the explosion, a flash of blinding white light. And then, the world went completely black, the sound of the blast deafening and final. 3 months passed, and the underworld changed, reeling from the loss of its central pillar. Lorenzo DeSantis, the man who had commanded the dark heart of the city, vanished without a trace, his name becoming a ghost story whispered in back rooms and dimly lit clubs. His empire was left to Allegra, who managed the chaos with cold, surgical precision, consolidating power and ruthlessly eliminating Marco's remaining assets. But she always looked exhausted, carrying the weight of the loss like a lead cloak, her eyes constantly searching the distance. She was the one who received the package, a simple, unmarked wooden box delivered by a quiet, anonymous courier to her private study, containing only a small, heavy digital recording device. She pressed the play button, and a familiar, slightly muffled voice, thick with emotion but completely calm, emerged from the speaker. It was my voice, scratchy and distorted but undeniable. "You didn't let me finish my curse, Lorenzo. It was meant to be for both of us. Now we can start over, in the dark." She listened, her hands trembling for the first time since the explosion, a look of profound, exhausted relief washing over her sharp features as the terrible certainty of my death was replaced by a dangerous, fragile hope. Deep underground, far from the wreckage of the mansion and the eyes of the world, in a concrete bunker hidden beneath the abandoned shipyard, a steel door groaned open, grating against the dusty floor. The air inside was cool and still, the only light provided by a single, bare utility bulb that cast long, dramatic shadows across the rough walls. Lorenzo stepped out of the shadows, his clothes simple, his face scarred by the blast, the coldness in his eyes now replaced by a quiet, measured patience, the look of a man who had been remade by fire. He was different, harder, but also more human, stripped of the pretense of untouchability, waiting for the final piece of his broken world to return. He looked toward the door, his gaze steady, waiting. It creaked open, and I stood there alive, bearing scars of my own, my body burned but my spirit unbroken, a mirror to his own survival. The simple emerald dress I was wearing was clean and pressed, the only splash of color in the gray, austere bunker. The same dress I had worn the night I took the bullet for his sister. He didn't speak. He just reached out a scarred hand toward me. An invitation, not a command. A silent acknowledgement of our shared, terrible journey. I walked to him, not running, not pleading, but walking with the quiet, undeniable dignity of a woman who had survived the fire she had started. I took his hand, my voice a soft, fierce whisper that held the promise of a shared future, a future outside the rules of the world above, a future defined by our own broken code. From now on, we cursed together. It wasn't about love in the traditional sense, but about absolute, mutual survival, and the recognition that we were two scarred souls who could only thrive in the darkness, side by side, ruling the ashes. I know what it's like to feel invisible, to have your quiet strength mistaken for weakness, and to watch the world try to crush your honor just because you don't fit into their expensive boxes, or because you choose to live by a different code. But you carry the fire, always. You are never small. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below, and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.